Good afternoon, everyone. It is noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully, we'll continue to welcome some more guests in over the next few minutes. My name is Gina Baugh. I'm the Director of Interprofessional Education for the Health Sciences Center, and I have the very fortunate opportunity to work with our panelists today on what is now a continual series that we started in the fall called The Essentials, where we've discussed some very, very meaningful topics with a kickoff during the Week of Purpose back in the fall semester. And we're continuing this session. We've decided to try an all virtual component for our faculty and staff members with the hopes of continuing on to some in-person activities for our students, faculty, and staff in the fall. So I'm excited about this session today. We are focusing on vulnerability and shame from Brené Brown. And if you haven't yet had the opportunity, I still encourage you, even after the session today, to listen to the TED Talks that we had shared with the invitation, as they are really enlightening. She's a great speaker to listen to. So I would encourage you to take a little bit of time to do that, whether it be while you're maybe outside enjoying, hopefully what we will start to get some warm weather consistently. So with me today, I'm very pleased to welcome our two panelists. We have Clay Marsh, excuse me, and Renée Nicholson. So both of them are joining us, and we'll start with comments from Clay Marsh first. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina, and good afternoon, everyone, and hello, Renée. It's really, to me, it's such a privilege to be able to be part of this series. And just as a really quick reminder, because it's been a little bit since we've had the last installment, the goal of this series is to try to connect on a number of issues that we think may both improve the experience that you and that we as a community, as a family can add to what we offer our members and members to be, but also that we think that these are personal growth moments and leadership growth moments that may enrich your personal perspectives, which can go beyond the job that you do with us and really start to connect with you at the personal level. And this is the, I think, fourth installment that we've had in our series. And I think that this particular conversation that we're going to have is perhaps the most important one we've had, or at least one of the very important ones we've had. And what we've done is to try to ground our conversations in data that could also be shared. We have chosen to use books to be a jumping off point by really very carefully selected authors. And also when there are other materials that could accompany that, like TED Talks, we share those. And Brené Brown is a really terrific researcher. She's a social worker from Texas. And her research was initially about connections, which we have talked about a little bit, particularly during, I think, our last installment when we talked about loneliness and the importance and the impact of loneliness, and used Vivek Murthy, our Surgeon General's book, together as a jumping off point there. But as Brené Brown was doing work and did research on connection, she found that there was really no connection without vulnerability. And she then started to become a vulnerability researcher. And you notice that the title for the session is Vulnerability and Shame. And what she found was that shame is the other side of the coin in some ways with vulnerability. And the way she defined shame, which I think is so important, because I think it does play back on a lot of the themes that we've just discussed previously. The way she describes shame is where you don't feel worthy of being loved. You don't feel worthy of being connected, of being a member of an organization or a community because you're not good enough. And this idea about that also being called loss of social capital which means that you don't feel like you fit in because you're not worthy of fitting in or belonging, is something that we've also found in a lot of the health literature, and particularly in some of the literature that Sir Angus Deaton and Ann Case have done in Princeton, where they've described deaths of despair and hopelessness, which impacts primarily Appalachia, West Virginia, and the Ohio River Valley, where people don't feel hope anymore. And part of feeling shame and not feeling good enough is feeling disconnected. And that's the reason why many people will say that the most important sign of a real problematic relationship or a problematic interface, let's say that you in a job or whatever, it's not when you are just angry or whatever, but when you become disconnected, when you don't care anymore about a relationship, about a position, about an organization, then that apathy, that disconnect is really part of the response from shame. And Brené Brown is really very intentional, which I think this is important for all of us, to separate shame and guilt. And shame, she says, is where you don't feel worthy of belonging. And guilt is where you did something that you didn't like, but you still feel worthy. And she makes that differentiation importantly in how we manage in our leadership positions or our other personal situations as parents, as leaders, to say it is really important, and this may seem subtle to some people, but really important, that when you criticize, you don't criticize the person. The person's not a liar, the person's not bad, but somebody may have told an untruth, or maybe they did something that wasn't approved of by their parent or somebody else. So the difference between I don't like your action and I don't like you is really importantly different. And what Brené Brown talks about is because shame is so prevalent in our culture and is so much that you feel that you have to defend yourself because you down deep may not feel worthy, but the way it gets expressed sometimes is you build layers of armor, that you have defense mechanisms used. It really blocks your ability to be vulnerable, to be authentic, to open yourself up. And by opening yourself up, she believes that's the only way to be vulnerable. It's the only way you can have true, lasting relationships. It's the only way you can really love with the unconditional love that is the love that we're talking about, where you can grow and grow in a way where you can help set the right culture, because psychological safety, which we've talked about, is such an important part of high performing organizations. Remember Project Google, which was Google's study into their best performing teams. They looked and tried to understand what were those characteristics that help their best performing teams, not happiest or most fulfilled team members, highest performing teams. They found the single thing that was the clear outlier in those teams was really high degrees of psychological safety. And high degrees of psychological safety not only allows trust to be built and relationships to be built, but it allows team members to be vulnerable. And per Brené Brown, vulnerability, true vulnerability, is one of the most important and most courageous things that any of us could do. And at the end, if we have time, I'm going to read the poem that she used leading into this, which was by Teddy Roosevelt, about, who you let criticize you, who you pay attention to, and how can you start to approach these real important issues that all of us have with shame and guilt and vulnerability and hope. And she says hope is not a feeling. Hope is an approach to a condition where you know what you want, you have a plan to get there, and you believe that that is possible for you. And all these things with shame and vulnerability really are a continuum of part of what we've talked about of scarcity and abundance. And what Brené Brown says is the most important way that we can feel hope is by having gratitude, because there's a lot of different elements that she discusses in the book. For instance, the worry that if everything's too good, then all of a sudden everything's going to fall through the ground, or the worry that whatever you're feeling, you're just kidding yourself, and you create the armor over it, and talks about victims and Vikings and victims as part of this, which are people that either can use aggression to try to overcome some of these things and mask some of this, or they become very submissive about not feeling that they're worthy to make a decision or a contribution. So I'm going to finish here, but the book to me is so important because it tied together a lot of research that she's done in a package that really starts, I think, to describe some of the other elements we've seen related to health in Appalachia and other places, and perhaps mental health issues, risk of substance use disorder, addiction, overdose, suicide, because when you feel disconnected, when you feel unworthy, then that is the most powerful negative emotion a human can have. And it makes us have such despair that a lot of times we just want to escape. And the answer for that is having loving relationships and helping yourself and seeking the appropriate help so that you start to heal yourself. And she talks a lot about that in her own journey. But the book, Daring Greatly, which is the book that we've used today, I've read twice in preparation for this. I thought it was amazing, sensational. She touches on a lot of salient points in her TED Talk. And so for me, I really did feel like that she started to bridge some of the gaps around some of the health in our state. And to me, as we start to think about mindset change from scarcity to abundance, we also have to start to think about how we deal with shame and help build the appropriate empowerment and feeling that you're capable, so that people, and gratitude, so that people then can shift that scarcity mindset to one of abundance. And I'll turn it back to you, Gina and Renee. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree. It connects so well with what we talked about this fall. She said that connection gives purpose and meaning to our lives. So it just beautifully blends everything we've talked about, starting with our first session in the fall about purpose. So the start of her TED Talk made me think of Renee, because she talks about how they first defined her. They didn't want to put she was a researcher because she thought that would draw no one. But then they wanted to mark her as a storyteller, which she struggled with. But when I think about such an eloquent storyteller and researcher, that definitely brings Renee to mind. So we always appreciate the way that you bring everything to a story. So with that, I will turn it over to you for comments, Renee.
Well, that's extraordinarily kind, and I appreciate it. I love these get-togethers, and I want to thank everybody for being here today. So I was rereading this, and I actually felt like I pulled a Brené Brown, because she talks about being a perfectionist and how perfectionism can lead to shame. So I get the book and I'm reading and I'm underlining and I'm making notes, and I've got to remember all this stuff. And I'm like, wait a second, I'm doing exactly what she says not to do. And that's how easy it is to fall into some of those patterns of behavior. So then I stepped back and I started thinking a lot about vulnerability, because I think vulnerability is something that, if you're, especially in artistic disciplines, but probably in any discipline in which people really are working with other people, which is almost everyone, right? Or working in situations that are going to be measured or graded in some way, which is pretty much anyone. Vulnerability plays a huge role in that. And for an artist, so much of that goes into the product, whether that's a painting or a poem or a song. And so it reminded me of an interview with the musical artist Prince from BET in 1998. And he's talking about putting his music out there. And he says, if you ask any artist, the music is a success upon creation. When you give it to somebody like a Rolling Stone or a Vibe and they start critiquing, then your perception changes. But that's looking through somebody else's eyes. So again, we gauge success upon what we feel in our hearts. We think with our hearts. just so perfect in terms of what Brené Brown is trying to lead us to, and that concept that she has of wholeheartedness as an approach to things. And one of the great things about the collaborations that I've done out of the Health Science Center has been narrative medicine. And in narrative medicine, we create these safe spaces so that we can all get vulnerable with the material, right? And it's just a great place where, like, the sciences meet art, where we see these intersections really, really clearly. So I love, Gina, that you thought of me as a storyteller researcher. At the beginning of that TED Talk, I was like, you have to own storyteller researcher. And I'm like, she has to own whatever she has to own, but maybe I'll own storyteller researcher. I'll turn it back to you, Gina.
Thank you so much, Renee. Perfect. So I don't know, Clay, if you have any additional comments or you want to open it up to the group for questions. It's completely up to you.
Thank you, Gina. I'm very pleased to open up to the group for questions. If not, we can certainly continue to discuss what we believe are the important points here. But the whole goal of this series is to try to have interactions with the audience, and also to provide audience members, if they choose to, and we had talked about like the first 20 people or whatever, but I think for the size of the group here, if people are interested in getting a copy of the book, then they should give us their contact information, their mailing address, and we will be most happy to provide copies of the book. And the TED Talk is really good as well. But this book I found was really good, not just for perhaps what you might expect as a demographic group for this kind of a book, but they talked about meeting with SWAT officers, and they talked about, so this vulnerability issue and shame, I just think is so extraordinary and so applicable to all of us in every situation, that I do think people really benefit from spending some time with this issue.
So there's no questions coming in yet. So if you want to go ahead, and I know you had spoken about a poem that you would like to share, if you want to do that, and we'll give the audience some time to post their questions in the Q&A, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So this is Teddy Roosevelt, who Brené Brown led into this with. And the poem is, it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how strong the man, how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who actually strives to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows at the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. And I think, and that's the name of the book, Daring Greatly. And I think that a lot of this, and we talked about grit from Angela Duckworth as in a previous one, where people that had this resilience were so important. And remember, Angela Duckworth has a grit scale, which is not about how physically fit you are, but how emotionally fit you are and how committed you are to a particular idea. And so she's able to predict very, very well about which folks are going to make, say, special forces training with the Navy SEALs. And it turns out that it's not about whether or not people at that level are physically fit, it's whether it's important enough to them or not. And I think Brené brings back this idea, Brené Brown does, that part of achievement is to approach things with openness and vulnerability, but also with grit. And she talks about shame resilience. And shame resilience, I think, is something that really starts to build on grit and starts to build on those connections and community. And we've talked about how powerful, and Gina, you mentioned it just now, how powerful connections are. But I think what it is we are so hardwired to connections. And part of connections give us our place in the group. And we are so committed to having this higher sort of purpose, this higher experience with the group and being a member of the group, and as opposed to just joining a group. And so I think that as we go, a lot of this is really comes back to the work that Brené Brown has done. And so by building this community and not only being shame resilient yourself and being able to navigate things, but have our whole community really focus on inclusion. When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, if we can make this a no shame zone, which I love that idea, where everybody's accepted and where we can make everybody, help everybody feel that you have a place with us, which is really what we're trying to do culturally, I think we really can make a humongous difference, because the burnout and the unhappiness in the workplace and everything else, I think is really an issue with disconnection, which may be from fatigue but she talks about that shame is the root of loneliness, and that issue that Vivek Murthy's talked about, which we've said is, and Vivek Murthy reported as he went around and talked to people to get his framework for being Surgeon General, that was the #1 problem that people were complaining of. So I think that we may have an epidemic not of loneliness, but really an epidemic of shame. And as Renée said, because we always feel like we should be better than we are, or, the Facebook friends, the social media, so we are constantly feeling that we're not enough. And to me, that's part of what the book said. I think we might have some questions too, as I'm
we do. We have some questions. So the first question that came in is, do you think feeling shame can be a habit for people?
You want to start, Renée?
I definitely think so, right? Anytime that we start having activities that we do, and some of that activity can be thought activity, right? And you keep doing it over time, that's building a habit. That's like the textbook definition of building a habit. And, this can be aided and abetted by, our environment and other people around us. If we're around a lot of people who are feeling shame and act a certain way, and we're in that same environment, it's like my granddad used to always tell me, you are who you run with. And so you get into these sorts of things, just like if you're in a walking group with a bunch of people, you get in the habit of healthy walking and doing that regularly, right? So I think most things are habit, right? Creativity is a habit. Vulnerability can be a habit. And the flip side of that is shame can be a habit.
I would also say that, and one thing that you just mentioned, Renée, struck a chord, because what Brené Brown also covered in her book was that many people, when they start to feel shame, think back to their childhood. And when we're kids, we're so dependent on our parents for our safety, for our well-being, for getting fed, etc. And if you're told that you're a terrible person, or you don't deserve to have whatever, those traumas that children experience really have profound impact on what happens through the rest of your life, thinking about habits. And that also really ties in beautifully to the results from the Adverse Childhood Experience Survey, which demonstrates that the more adverse experiences, traumas that you remember having in childhood, and this is at any age, then predictably your health is worse the more traumas that you remember and perceive, and your lifespan is shorter. So these events have dramatic impacts on your entire life, and childhood is a seat of these events. And that's where we also get our formative learning oftentimes. So I think that as we go forward, being cognizant of that, and then starting to work with somebody else so that you can start to heal those parts that you still perceive as traumatized, even though maybe your childhood was many years ago, I think is an important opportunity for people.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have questions coming in, which is excellent. So another question is, many health professional students come to us with high levels of success and perfectionism. And Renee, like you, I thought the same thing about even with the messy desk comment about how it needs to be straightened up. How do we assist these students that have these high levels coming in with high levels of success and perfectionism? How do we assist them with moving beyond that to understand the importance of connection and vulnerability?
Wow, I love that question. Thank you for that question. And anytime you're around high achievers, like I think this is something that can be a pitfall, right? Because there are so many external markers that we look to define our success. I do this all the time. I've done it in multiple things. Starting again, we were talking about children, because I often bring up my past as a young person as a dancer. I mean, talk about perfectionism. I mean, you're trying to perfect steps, you're trying to perfect your body, you're trying to live up to a certain standard that was set by somebody who's not you. It's classic. And I would love to tell you that I've gotten over it, but I'm always like, have I put enough work out there? Is it good enough? Am I in the right places with it? And so it's really easy to fall into those kinds of things. I think one of the best things that we can do for students especially is be vulnerable ourselves, talk about the challenges we had in the individual ways that we've gotten past those. I have a couple accountability partners, but it's not accountability like, am I doing the work? It's accountability, am I loving the work, right? And to this point, I was reading this book, and a good friend of mine knew I was reading this book, and all of a sudden get this pen that says, I am enough, right? And that's one of the things she says in this book, I am enough. And so if we can model that, right, we are imitative beings, right? We look to each other to be models. And so, I often have to pause and be like, okay, step back a second, and take that deep breath. So I'll be excited to hear Clay's and Gina, your thoughts on this too.
Do you want to make any comments, Gina?
Yes, please do.
I would just say that Renee, what you said really it strikes such an important chord. We have so many people in our environment that are so incredibly talented, really smart, etc. But I think what you figure out, the Sufi poet Rumi said, yesterday I was clever and wanted to change the world. Today I am wise and decided to change myself. And I think that when you have people that are really externally oriented, and Brené Brown talks a lot about this, where you're looking for acceptance. That was the poem that Roosevelt said. It's not the critic that matters, it's other people in the arena. We know that for children, it's so much more important to praise them on effort than on outcome. And Brené Brown says that shame is biology and biography. And so I think that as we go forward, we have to remember that we so closely identify ourselves with our story, whatever that story is. And in fact, the root word of person is persona, which means actor's mask. And so we go through our life that performing, and we have our stories, and we identify very strong with those stories. And some of the stories are that we're the best student, or we're the best researcher, or we're the best mom or dad or whatever. But the truth is that we are all part of an interconnected whole. Namaste, the divine in me bows to the divine in you. And we're all perfectly imperfect in the ways that we are. And as Brené Brown, as you said, Brené Brown, as I remember in the book, has over her desk at home, I am enough. That's what she wants to remind herself. And while we're all perfectly imperfect, if we fixate on some performance metric, whether it's I make more money than somebody, I went to a better school than somebody, I have better kids, a better house, a better spouse, whatever, then those things are always at risk for falling. And after a while, if a relationship doesn't work or if a school doesn't fit, then you trap yourself into this idea that you've identified with this part of you or this vision of you that's not authentic. And then it takes a lot of energy to support that. And this fake life that you're, that you're acting in, or this mask that you're acting with. And to me, vulnerability and authenticity is about trying to strip all that down. But it's hard to do that if you don't feel safe. And it's hard to do that if you don't feel that you have the important connections in your life with people that help you do that. So for students, to me, I always talk about the process and their effort versus their outcomes. And whether it's a student or a faculty member, almost all of the people I talk to that are really, really, hard to offer support to because they're so upset, it's where they lose the ability to differentiate their personal worth and value, which can never be assailed. You are intrinsically valuable, and their performance. So maybe they did something that wasn't the greatest, but who they are is still untouchable, and they get mixed up with their performance equaling their personal worth. And that's where I think you see a lot of downsliding. Gina, turn it to you.
I completely agree. It's interesting. I do my morning workout, and part of my one workout program, she's very inspirational. And one thing she tells us at one of our workouts is, right now, I want you to tell yourself something good about yourself. We're so quick to just sit here and say, I'm not strong enough, I'm not fast enough, I'm not thin enough, I'm not good enough. And she says, right now, I want you to give yourself a compliment. And it's kind of, sometimes it's so hard to look at the positive aspects, especially because, we're our own worst critic. So I think it's, looking, I love how she talks about you have to find that within yourself. And then that will, kind of go towards your team who you're working with. And I think we're all trying to show that our team that we work with at work or in our personal lives is worthy. And we're worthy of our love, and they're worthy of our love. So I love the comments from both of you. There's so many good questions. It's so hard for me to decide what to ask you both next.
Let me also say that she quoted Leonard Cohen, who I love, and Anthem, Hallelujah song. And she quoted that love is not a victory march. Love is a cold and broken hallelujah, meaning that, it's not like all, perfect. Our lives are imperfect, but we have a perfect path as we look backwards through our lives, which brings us to that whole heart. So I thought that was a really cool way to look at things next.
Absolutely. So because we are so, really focusing on, and I love that our panelists include the two of you, really trying to show the connections between the arts and the sciences. One of the questions that came in says, what lessons or experiences have you each gained from being a physician and from being an artist that help you express gratitude to be more authentic in your interactions?
Wow, that is a powerful question and a lovely question. That's a really hard one to answer in some ways, because some of it's just so felt, it's almost beyond words, which maybe is a strange thing for a poet and essayist to say, but I'm okay with being vulnerable with that. I think that the thing I'm grateful for every time is that there's a reader at the end of whatever I've put, and whether that's a big audience, a small audience, an audience of one, an audience of many, there's something beautiful about creating that cycle, right? And that when you read a poem, an essay, a short story, or you interact with art, you complete a circle, right? As a co-creator. That's just so filled with gratitude. And for me personally, it was my art that allowed me to start working with doctors, with nurses, with occupational therapists, with many, many different kinds of patients. And people who just open themselves up to me without hardly knowing me. I mean, imagine being in the chemotherapy center and you're used to your nurses, you're used to your oncologists. And then I come up and I'm like, hi, I'm a poet. I'm here to write a story with you. And you're sitting there getting your medicine and you say, okay, yeah, sure. I mean, what a gift in this world to enter into those stories. I will forever be grateful for all the people who shared their stories with me.
And I would just say that two things, and I'll be short. Number one is it's just an incredible privilege to be able to help and serve. And that is something that's really foundational. And it leads to, I think, an abundant heart, because, you figure out that for all of us, we're sharing this incredible human experience, and we're sharing it from different vantage points. And to be able to be with people who are, who are ill, who are getting better, it's just, it's a privilege. The other thing I would say is it's an amazing thing to get to see life begin and to life to end. And what you figure out is life doesn't exit the body. Life comes into the body to create it and create the human experience, and then life leaves the body at the end. And this idea that life is something different than our bodies are was an incredible observation. And it really changed my whole outlook and belief system on almost everything. So it's hard not to be grateful when you're privileged enough to be able to help serve and also have those kind of foundational experiences that change the way that you look at everything.
I love those comments. Experiencing that personally, it really does change you and really change, your entire outlook on life. So thank you for both of you for your willingness to share that. So I guess shifting gears a little, although you're both very vulnerable in those answers, how can we encourage our colleagues to be vulnerable in our specific departments? That was another question that came in.
Yeah, these are, wow, that's such fantastic questions. Yeah, I'm thinking like if I were a comic artist, like I could see the comic strips of somebody like gripping somebody, be vulnerable with me, right? And then the thing they want to do least then is be vulnerable. So I think, one of the things that I think can be very powerful is to first be vulnerable with other people. And it's hard. I think there's especially in a work situation, I want to be crisp. I want to be professional. I want to be thought of as somebody who knows what they're talking about. And so vulnerability kind of means taking all that and being like, okay, set you aside and just like being, all right, I'm messy, one of the things that I did, I taught a class for our honors college called Medicine in the Arts, in which most of my students told me that they took the class because they saw medicine in the title and it would fit for their arts and creativity gen ed. And then proceeded to tell me there was no way that they were ever going to be able to do something like draw a picture or write a poem. And the class completely disproved that. But I think they had to see that, like, all right, yeah, I write poems and they get published and I have books. And those early ones are sometimes awesomely bad. They do not come out perfectly formed. They are perfectly imperfect, to use Brené Brown's language. And in a lot of cases, I started to show students how many revisions I went through, how many times I came back to something, right? And so I have to think that in any profession that there's a way to do that, where you can say, look, I didn't start off being perfect at whatever it is, and to be able to kind of peel back those layers and show the development. It makes somebody hopeful that they can get there. It also honors the process, which I think we're so product focused, and I get into this too. But the thing that brings the most joy is actually the process. So I think there will probably be ways in most professional settings that we can do that. But I think it starts by saying, like, all right, I'm going to put myself out there in a way that I'm not used to. And maybe it's a little scary, and that's okay.
And that's a beautiful answer. And I agree with you, Renee. These questions are quite amazing. I guess, Gina, I would just say that's really the power of great culture. And part of what we aspire to is to create a place that doesn't make a requirement that everybody becomes vulnerable, but that starts to create the environment that people can feel safe and perhaps be authentic or more authentic and share things that are hard to share because of the concern that you'll be rejected or, somebody won't like your idea or whatever. And that is, to me, where, safety, vulnerability, and trust start to become, part of the same playing field. And, she also said that it's important that some people can use vulnerability like a tool, like you're sharing so much because you're trying to position yourself as the most vulnerable one in the room or whatever. And so she said she carries a list of people that she'll be vulnerable with, that's earned. That's not just something. So I think in a workplace, we want to provide the opportunity for people to share what they feel is important, but from the vulnerability, even if it's not personally sharing a whole bunch of stuff, and that's fantastic if you have that kind of relationship with other people in the workplace, but from a work standpoint, to be able to bring your best self in the room, to be connected. Because there was also a statement she said from a high school student that she interviewed that said that some teachers invited you to ask questions and to raise things that weren't right, but most of them, you knew they didn't want you to say anything, and you stuck your head down and tried to do good on your grades. And then talking to teachers, the teachers said that we teach from love and that we don't teach for results, we teach from love. So I think that there's this whole opportunity for us to bring people together on common ground so that we can start to be understood, because eventually I think understanding each other and being open to understand you from where you come from, not from where I want you to come from. The difference between being included and belonging is really important. So I do think that these principles are so important, but the dynamics of the environment also so important. Biology and biography, the stories that create the culture, along with the way that we're tuned as people, and what we're bringing to the table as far as our previous traumas and life experiences, all important.
Thank you. Thank you. And as she says, we need to make sure that she says vulnerability is not weakness. So we need to make sure that we're establishing a culture where we, make sure that all of our team members know that being vulnerable doesn't mean that you're weak, and that you're a lesser member of the team. So wonderful. So I think we have about 6 minutes. So I think we can definitely at least take one more, if not two more.
Okay.
So another question is, how does a caregiver help a person feeling shame or despair? Is there any best practice evidence?
So, there are maybe a million ways to answer this question, and I think it's an important one, but I will go into storyteller mode for a second. So I saw this happen with a WVU physician. His name is Ryan McCarthy. And he started to see in March 2020 that the shift in what was going on wasn't just biomedical, but it was social and cultural. And so he was looking at a way to heal himself and realized that everyone around him needed opportunities to connect and heal. And so Ryan started this podcast called Healthcare is Human, but he did like, I'll call it Podcast Plus, because he had this childhood friend who is now a professional photographer, wonderfully trained in London and an art school there, does beautiful portrait photography, and captured the pictures of the people that they interviewed for the podcast. And the more that they talked to people, the more those people were feeling better about what they were doing. They were getting their stories out there. And the more that Ryan did this, the more he connected with people on that essential level of story. And I think that that's a model that you can use in a lot of situations. When I saw this work, I was just excited, floored, sometimes at a loss for words, sometimes just in awe of standing in the presence of some of these incredible photographs. And so, is that going to be in every situation that you're going to like, I'm going to pull my friend, the professional photographer, and get the stories? But it started with an engagement. And I think that engagement can be applied, across a lot of different scenarios. And if you're somebody on the downtown campus, or not the downtown campus, but the Morgantown Health Sciences campus, you can connect with our colleague Andrea Labus, who's been doing a lot of work in narrative medicine. And, I know that she loves to create these sessions, and they can be really helpful in forging that as part of the culture.
That was so nicely said. Maybe I'll take it from just a little bit different of an angle, because caretaker or caregiver can mean a lot of different roles. Some can be healthcare, patient roles. Some can be parents, children roles, children, parent roles, depending on what you do. I think the key, and this goes back to Brené Brown, but it also, I think, many other sources, that if you really love the people you're with and they feel that, and you do it in a, not I love you because you're doing this or that, but you do it in a more unconditional way. And culture is the way, she described culture as the way that we do things around here. So ultimately, every family has a culture, every organization has a culture, but really every person has a culture. And I think the culture of acceptance, the culture of unconditional love, which means vulnerability, the culture of honesty and authenticity, and I think the culture of connection and community are all really powerful ways that we create the environment so that we welcome vulnerability. And as you said, Gina, I think that can't be overemphasized enough. Vulnerability is courage. Vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability is courage. And you have to come to that, because all of us are dealing with issues of shame and perfectionism and not being enough, or worried that the bottom's going to fall out because it's going too well. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that you can look at this, but the truth is, we are imperfect in almost every way, no matter how much we try to be some model vision of ourselves. And the key is loving yourself is so important, because you can't be better for somebody else than you are for yourself. And that to me is the final lesson that I think is important from this book, is this is not a training module, or our series isn't to try to tell you how to be perfect in dealing with situation A, B, C, D, or E. This is a pathway that we hope will stimulate people to start to feel like that, your journey becomes, so important, because the better you are in how you've dealt with yourself and how you love yourself unconditionally, that then spreads to everybody in your environment. And in fact, that's the Sufi poet Rumi. You can't look out here to begin with. You always have to look in here. And that's where this whole series is really trying to lead.
Well, that was a great ending. I couldn't agree more. I loved, she said that vulnerability is the birthplace of creativity, innovation, and change. So how perfect for us in academia and those of us logged in today to, remember that and just remember I am enough. So I thank everyone for joining. Katie is going to go ahead and share a slide that has a very brief survey so that we can hear what you enjoyed about today, suggestions you have for improvement, and we would also love to gain your contact information so that we can share copies of the book with you, because it's certainly worth the time and the read. I think we all can benefit from it. So please join me in giving a virtual round of applause to our panelists, Clay and Renee, who I think were very vulnerable in sharing of their personal insights with us this afternoon. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll be sending you out information about our next session. Thank you.